I would now like to introduce our speaker for the annual lecture, which is commemorating our founding president, Sir William Taylor, who founded our association in 1932. This lecture will commemorate him. I'm sure you all know Dr. Ronan Kelly. If you haven't heard him speak before, you're in for a treat. Ronan has written a fantastic book about the College of Surgeons, and he's going to speak to us today about that. Every branch of the healing art, a history of the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. Thank you so much, Ronan. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. How's the volume there? All good? Okay. Well, it's an honor and it's a privilege to deliver this year's Sir William Taylor lecture. I've never actually given a named lecture before, so this is a delightful first for me. And my sincere thanks to Dr. Erica Keane for inviting me to do so. I've written a history of RCSI, and that's what I'm here to speak about. And that project was, without question, a highlight of my professional career to date. But I'm going to start by taking us all the way back to last month to another career highlight. See if this works. Myself and my excellent colleague Jessica Handy in RCSI Heritage Collections put on a play with a number of first-year students. It was called Miasma, John Snow and the Fight Against the Cholera Pandemic. The author is Colin Murphy. Some of you may know his previous work, The Guarantee, or Haughey Gregory, or the film he made with Charlie Bird, Ransom 79. It's currently on the Virgin Media Player, so do check it out. It's really excellent. Here are the students in action up in the Nightingale Theatre. Those of you who know the room will recognize those distinctive roof trusses. It was a scripts in hand performance. So we rehearsed for 4 mornings and then did the show on the Thursday afternoon. And the author, Colin, came in the next day for a brilliant Q&A. And the reason this all went so well, the reason this was another career highlight for me, and the reason I'm telling you about it now, is because it did a magical thing. It brought history to life. It literally brought history to life. Students, and that is future doctors, stood in the shoes of their predecessors and argued and scoffed and pleaded and harangued, because in the world of the play, the debates were right in the moment. The truth was up for grabs. Opinions were not yet orthodoxies. The students could see and feel that some people were right and some people were wrong, and some people were, in fact, both things at the same time. So for the next 30 minutes or so, I'll invite you to do something similar, to put yourselves in certain shoes from the past, from RCSI's past, and to imagine, if you will, what it was like not to know what was coming after your moment, because we have that in common, us and everyone who has come before us. We don't really know what's next. Well, I kind of do because I have a script, but you know what I mean. So let's start by going back in time, much further back than last month, back to a time before RCSI even existed. And let's keep with my dramatic theme by invoking the frame of the classical 5-act structure. So this is Act 1, exposition. In medieval times, you did not want to meet a surgeon. And with the greatest respect to any surgeons in the audience, perhaps you still don't want to meet one, at least in a professional capacity. But back then, you really, really didn't want it. Generally speaking, you lived with what ailed you, and only when you thought you couldn't stand it anymore did you resign yourself to visiting the surgeon, or, as was the case then, the barber surgeon. These happy guys. For the two professions, barbers and surgeons were grouped together in the same guild. And for most people, there was little difference between the two. With a sharp enough blade, one could shave a beard as readily as one could lance an abscess. Some operators were better than others, but any practice meant pain, often to excruciating degrees. Operations had to be performed fast, somewhat mercilessly, and anesthesia was, needless to say, non-existent, though both patient and surgeon might well swig something highly alcoholic to steady the nerves and lessen the horror. The result of all this was that surgeons occupied a rather lowly status in medieval society. Now, contrast this with the physician, if you will, a different species altogether. The physician went to university, whereas the surgeon learned by apprenticeship, as in the other practical trades, blacksmiths or carpenters, say. The physician was literate, read Latin, and they called themselves doctors. It was not until well into the 19th century that they even used any instruments in making their diagnoses. The surgeons, by contrast, carried a terrifying array of tools, saws, knives, hooks, needles, and lancets. They might well have been illiterate, like their clients. So to advertise, they placed a sign above the door, the helical red and white pole, still familiar in barbershops today. And as you know, red and white remain the colors of RCSI's livery. The microchip swipe card that I use every day is red and white, and there's a lovely confluence there of the medieval and the digital. Perhaps you've even seen these poles in action. They're still carried on ceremonial occasions. The blue stripe you sometimes see in barbershops, by the way, that's a much later American edition. Surgeons didn't have degrees and weren't doctors, so they didn't have that title. They were simply Mr., and it was Mr. at the time, just like Mr. Blacksmith or Mr. Carpenter. For all their lowly status, however, surgeons did begin to make significant strides, and certainly by the 18th century, continental surgeons were putting their profession on scientific principles. And any diligent Irish surgeons who travelled for training saw this. And one person who did so was the Limerick-born surgeon Sylvester O'Halloran. And when he came back from studies in Paris and elsewhere, he produced a short document entitled Proposals for the Advancement of Surgery in Ireland. And you'll see that I'm drawing attention here to what is actually just an appendix to a longer work. Quite often surgeons cut out appendices and throw them away, but happily in this instance they held on to it. O'Halloran said that surgery in Ireland needed three things. There should be a list of reputable surgeons, because before that you could just call yourself a surgeon and get going. There should be a decent and convenient edifice erected in Dublin, and professorships should be founded to teach and conduct exams. And this was in 1765, and really not much happened for a period. In general, anytime a surgeon made moves to improve the profession, they were outvoted by their much more numerous barber brethren. And inspired by this, I try to avoid the barbers as much as I can. So then in 1780, a group who called themselves the Dublin Society of Surgeons took the baton. Here's their minute book, which we still have in the archive. And they set about petitioning the Crown to dissolve what they called the preposterous and barbarous union they laboured under. Actually spelled the word preposterous wrong. Can't have everything. 4 years later, on the 11th of February, 1784, they received a charter from King George III, and the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland was established. I'm sure you're all familiar with the replicas just outside in the entrance hall. In the book, I describe the charter as being about the size of a small tablecloth. And I often think there is a nice little merchandising opportunity just waiting to get going there. Again, as you know, we still celebrate the granting of the charter every year. The particular tradition of holding a dinner on or close to the 11th of February, however, that just dates from 1911. If that's our birth date, In terms of birthplace, we can say that RCSI was born in the Rotunda because the first meeting of the college took place there, and we have that minute book too. So that's our establishment. That's our Act 1 exposition, as it were. And now we can move to Act 2, rising action. The Charter is immensely important to RCSI. It represents a declaration of independence, and that's very much of the era too, that breaking away from the old way of doing things. It is revolutionary thinking in a revolutionary age. The surgeons break from the barbers, 1784, comes right between the American and French revolutions, 1776 and 1789, and that's no coincidence. But in a way, too, the Charter was merely a permission slip. Off you go, it said, but no money came with it and no premises. From that first Rotunda meeting, RCSI continued to meet in rooms and taverns for some 5.5 years before first settling in a rented house in Mercer Street, which was conveniently close to Diggs Lane, Goat Alley, as it was called then, for a nighttime activity I'll get into in just a moment. In 1805, RCSI took over a Quaker graveyard on the corner of York Street and St. Stephen's Green and began building this temple to surgery. This is the decent and convenient edifice that O'Halloran called for, but it is also very much a stone testament to the rise of a profession. You build something like this in the city centre, and you are really shaking off that ignominious old barber connection. The building opened its doors in 1810, but as you'll have already noticed, it is not of the dimensions you know well. No sooner was it up, then it had to be massively expanded to this. They couldn't go any further south because of York Street, so they went north, adding the span of 4 new windows. 3 of these are false windows, as there was a museum inside to be protected from sunlight. That's the room you now know as College Hall. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any images of College Hall when it was a museum, but you can get an idea of it from this, which was actually a second, smaller museum in the college. Can anybody tell me where it was? Old anatomy room. Not quite. Yeah, I guess we all have different reference points at this time. But I guess for me, those same distinctive roof trusses give it away. It's that area where the Nightingale is and lower again. So a floor has since been put in. The little bit of light you see on the left side, is it left for you there? Are those windows on York Street? Whereas, of course, College Hall doesn't have any windows around the side. It's substantial enough. It's a big space even then. The expansion was made possible because RCSI was successful. And its success was largely owed to 2 people. First was a man named Abraham Collis, who was a student here and a professor here, and at the age of 29, president of RCSI. And Collis is probably RCSI's most famous alumnus, present company accepted, of course. And he is known in emergency departments worldwide for the Collis fracture, which, as you all know, is caused by a fall on an outstretched hand, resulting in that characteristic dinner fork shape. That's all very well, but in fact, Collis's greater claim to fame is the way he revolutionized the teaching of anatomy, which he did in this little book. The treatise was supposed to be part of a series. You can see it says part the first there, but he never got round to writing the other parts. Why? Well, he was very, very busy teaching. In fact, he was so dedicated to teaching that he was still doing it after he died. He asked his pals to dissect him when he was dead and to publish their findings in a learned journal, and they did so. And that's really the sort of dedication to the job you want to be, professorial material. I'm sure you agree. So yes, it was Collis's brilliant teaching that attracted students to RCSI, necessitating the expansion. But the other person we have to thank for this growth is this guy on the right. Napoleon was not especially short. That was That was just a little good old British propaganda. I quite enjoyed the movie from a couple of years back. I think I'm the only person who saw it. From the late 1790s right up to the moment Napoleon meets his Waterloo, there is a constant demand for army and naval surgeons. The 16th century father of French surgery, Ambroise Paré, suggested that there is just one group who benefits from war, and it is young surgeons. And truth be told, it is probably the institutions that train those young surgeons who benefit the most. And in the first quarter of the 19th century, the same conflicts that destroyed the lives of millions provided an unrelenting windfall for RCSI. So paying for that expansion was really not a problem at all. And I know I'm being somewhat flippant about conflicts from long ago, but I'm also well aware that the terrible need for healthcare professionals of all types in contemporary war zones is an absolutely harrowing subject. Staying with the Napoleonic era just a little longer, the demand for surgeons meant there was a demand for cadavers to learn from. And for obvious reasons, obvious taboos, cadavers were in short supply for hundreds of years. The great anatomist Vesalius used to plead with judges not to sentence criminals to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, as that would ruin them for dissection. And William Harvey, the man who described the circulation of blood in 1628, found it so hard to get hold of bodies that he went so far as to dissect his own father and his sister. So what did you do if you needed to learn, if you needed to teach? Enter the body snatchers. The figure of death here is very helpfully holding the lamp. These guys did the dirty work to supply the medical schools. Now, by RCSI's time, it was all a bit grey legally. Cadavers were needed, so the authorities largely turned a blind eye when fresh bodies were snatched from the graveyard and conveyed under cover of darkness to the various schools of anatomy around the city. And there were many such small schools. Medical education was very much a growth industry at the time. So hence the utility of Goat Alley earlier and of Glover's Alley when RCSI moved to the Green. If you know that cobbled lane here behind me, you'll know that there's a back door there that leads more or less directly into the anatomy room. It wasn't a felony to steal a body. No one owned it. But it was to take the clothes. So you'd get the resurrectionists, as they were known, lifting a body from a grave, stripping it and popping it in a bag. The other name for them was the sack-em-up men. Everything had to be done fast, ideally on the night of the funeral itself, as this was the era before formaldehyde. And if you were going to learn anything, you really had better learn it quick, smart, before putrefaction set in. If the state and the school authorities conveniently looked the other way, and the night watchmen did the same thanks to a bribe or two, members of the public did not feel the same way. And in fact, one RCSI porter was caught in possession of a body in 1828 by an angry mob, for which he was killed. What they did with that body, I do not know. Why would you take that risk? Well, it was extremely lucrative. In fact, demand was so high in British medical schools that Irish resurrectionists were disinterring bodies for export in crates to London or Glasgow or Edinburgh, and they labelled these crates cheddar or herring, just to put the people off the track, as it were. It was in Edinburgh that the bottom fell out of the market when it was discovered that two Irish labourers, two lads called Burke and Hare, weren't even bothering to disinter bodies. Instead, they were knocking heads in the street and delivering their victims to the professor of anatomy at the university. This scandal resulted in the Anatomy Act of 1832, following which there was ample provision of cadavers for medical schools would then be legally provided, usually I will add from prisons and workhouses. You all know that the anatomy room today is very much a sacrosanct space, but you may not know that since 1989 there has been an interfaith service of thanksgiving and remembrance for those who donated their bodies for teaching and research. And another even more recent initiative has been the white coat ceremony at the start of the year, where it is impressed upon students what an extraordinary act of generosity it is to donate one's body. Okay, still with the rising action, RCSI's professor of anatomy in this period was this chap, Arthur Jacob. I'm very fond of Jacob. He gave me the title of my book, Every Branch of the Healing Art. Jacob was an ophthalmologist, which gives me the opportunity of quoting his description of a cataract operation. And do bear in mind, this is a pre-anesthetic world. I seat the patient in a chair and make him sit straight up or inclining according to his height. If very tall, I raise myself by standing on a large book or two. In my own place of business, I find old medical folios answer the purpose well. When he is seated, I lay the patient's head against my chest, and placing the middle finger of my left hand on his lower eyelid and the forefinger on his upper eyelid, and gently holding the eye between them, I strike the point of the needle suddenly into the cornea, and there hold it until any struggles of the patient cease. There must be no hesitation here. For if the cornea be touched without fixing the point of the needle in it, the eye will turn rapidly and the surface will be scratched. I advise the operator to pause here for a moment, holding the eye firmly and steadily on the point of his needle, and if necessary, to say a word of encouragement or remonstrance to the patient. In the on-screen quote, is it too small to make out? Jacob is basically arguing that the age-old distinction between surgeons and physicians no longer obtains. And this is 1844. To be a good surgeon, you needed to be a good physician, and to be a good physician, you needed to be a good surgeon. That distinction was officially rendered obsolete by an amendment to the Medical Act of 1886, which required a triple qualification in medicine, surgery, and midwifery in order to be entered in the medical register. At that point, RCSI and RCPI on Kildare Street began to issue a conjoint license, and I'm presuming that many of you are holders of the historic letters testimonial from both institutions. And if you qualified after 1978, you were also given a degree from the NUI, and if you qualified after 2010, you received yet another degree, this time from RCSI itself, as it had been granted degree awarding status. We're still on rising action. There really is a lot of it. So let's look at this chap, Sir Philip Crampton, four-time RCSI president. Crampton was probably the most famous surgical practitioner in Dublin in the mid-19th century. He owned one house on Merrion Square and another at Lochbray in County Wicklow. In advanced age, he liked to boast that he could still swim across the loch right into Dublin and amputate a limb all before he'd even had his breakfast. In some respects, Crampton's interests were more zoological than medical, though in the era, this was not a distinction that really mattered very much. He was the first president of the Dublin Zoological Society and was instrumental in securing the zoo's home in Phoenix Park. He even has a species of giant extinct sea reptile named in his honor, and how many of us can really say the same? The 7-foot-long plesiosaur, Romalosaurus cramptoni. And yet, within 2 generations, he was all but forgotten. In Joyce's Ulysses, Leopold Bloom rides in a carriage past a memorial in Crampton's honor, and he thinks, who was he? This was the memorial. Does anybody recognize the location? Yeah, College Green, that College Green, Delir Street, prize for and that direction. There's the stain that is there, the long stone, the stain by Steyne, near where the old screen cinema used to be, that location. So at the base of this one in its day, there was, everyone knows where it is? Yeah. Pierce Street, College Street, Delir Street, that junction. At the base was a public fountain. That reflected the surgeon's interest in the supply of drinking water to the city of Dublin. This was topped with a bust of Crampton, set amid a variety of bird life. He also has an avian eye muscle named in his honor. And above that, there are towers 25 feet of exotic metal fronds. Now, from the start, opinion seems to have been divided on whether it was offensively hideous or merely laughable. Locals dubbed it the cauliflower or the artichoke, while Miles McGopaleen called it an enormous rotting pineapple. A letter writer to the Irish Times asked if it was erected to frighten passers-by into one of the 11 pubs in the immediate vicinity, and Crampton himself was, of course, a teetotaler. Worse was to come. In 1959, part of the sculpture's foliage collapsed on a postal worker who was eating his lunch. He was taken to Mercer's Hospital, where he made a full recovery. But it was the end of the Crampton Memorial, which was duly dismantled and carted off. Now, Act 3, climax. And what could be more climactic than guns and bullets, the shootout scene? I will get to that, but first I want to redress the balance of who we've seen on screen. And so far we've had lots of men, but I want to say something about the story of women at RCSI. So where better to start with than a man with a beard? This, as you know well, is Sir Charles Cameron. And as president of RCSI, Cameron was the individual responsible for opening the doors of the college to women, both for the license and the more demanding fellowship. And that was in 1885. This is the first woman who studied at RCSI to earn her license, Mary Josephine Hannon. And this is Emily Winifred Dixon, the first woman to obtain the fellowship. And that was in 1893. And just for context, the Royal College of Surgeons in London did not admit female fellows until 1920. Dixon was gifted. She consistently came top of her class. She won prizes and traveling scholarships. They didn't always work out. In Berlin, she was told that they thought Winifred was a man's name when they accepted her, and so she wasn't allowed to attend classes. And there was prejudice back home too. When she was appointed an examiner in midwifery and gynecology here in RCSI, the students protested and organised a petition to get her removed. The council received the petition but refused to entertain it. Both of these portraits were painted long after Hannon and Dixon had died, because in 2019, RCSI commissioned 8 new portraits of women who have made significant contributions to the RCSI story, and these now hang upstairs in the boardroom. They changed the room, and they changed the narrative we tell about ourselves, about the institution. So this is Mary Strangman. She was a fellow of the college, suffragist, and Waterford's first female councillor. This is Dr. Barbara Stokes, founder of St. Michael's House. I think that's probably my favorite one. In the room, it just shimmers. I think you'll agree. This is Mary Frances Crowley, founder of RCSI's Faculty of Nursing. This is Sister Dr. Maura Lynch, who revolutionized obstetric fistula care in Uganda, basically transformed the lives of thousands of young women. The story there is that she campaigned for years to have a surgeon sent to her region. And when none was forthcoming, she got on a plane, she came to Dublin, she studied, she earned her fellowship, and basically she got back on the next plane and got to work. The really wonderful thing about this Women on Walls project was that it allowed us to go back into RCSI's rich history and tell a new story, one that hadn't been told before. And as a historian, I love that. I love that our perspectives change and our priorities change. Let me give you another little case in point. Cameron was RCSI's first historian, but by the time his book appeared in 1916, the Easter Rising had already happened. He was basically outpaced by history. In 1949, when another RCSI professor, J.D.H. Widdis, wrote a new history, feelings were obviously still mixed about the whole rebellion. 1916 still didn't feature, not until a second edition came about in 1967. And even then, it was still just an appendix. And we've already discussed what surgeons like to do with appendices. For me, the goings-on during the rebellion comprise the longest chapter in my book, and it was absolutely one of my favorite sections to write. The reason that the rebels took over the college after things fell apart from them in the Green is because they were safe here, thanks to those false windows I spoke of earlier. The rebel Margaret Skinner said the army might as well have been firing pea shooters at them. It made so little difference. In fact, the biggest problem for the rebels in the college was a scarcity of food, whereas their foes were well fed from the kitchens of the Shelburne Hotel, the Russell Hotel, and the United Services Club. So do bear that in mind if you're planning a rebellion of your own. On the day of the surrender, Countess Markievicz kissed her revolver, before handing it over to Captain Henry de Courcy Wheeler, whose brother was an RCSI president and whose father was an RCSI president and whose wife was a first cousin of Markievicz herself. It was a small world for some in those days. But after the storm, the calm. So this is Act 4. Falling action. It is an uneasy calm, to say the least, because we're moving into a new dispensation, a royal college in a free state. The challenge now was just to keep the lights on, as it was really for so much of the country. In 1922, the Rockefeller Foundation arrived in Ireland with the aim of dispensing some largesse. But it was 1922. The country was in turmoil, so they decided to come back later. When they did, they were unimpressed with what they found. There were too many students, too many schools. Teachers were practitioners, not academic specialists. Clinical experience was barely supervised, with students wandering from one hospital to another as the mood took them. The complication of denominational hospitals was also noted. Over time, the Americans discovered that, and this is a quote, medical education in Ireland is no simple educational matter, but one involving some of the deepest and most sensitive emotions and sympathies of the Irish people. If this was news to the Americans, it certainly was not to anyone in the Irish medical community. Adding insult to these injuries, when a leading Rockefeller thinker produced a comprehensive comparative survey of American and European medical schools, Ireland was left out entirely. Even Graves and Stokes were referred to as English. Ideally, the foundation wanted to see a single medical school in the Free State, born of a union of TCD and UCD, and attached to a hospital untethered from religious control. Again, the entire Irish medical community would have known that this sat ill with the realpolitik of things on the ground. Nearly 30 years later, not much, in 1950, not much had changed. When the American Medical Association produced a list of approved overseas medical schools which were deemed comparable with their own, none of the schools of the Irish Republic made the grade, only Queen's in Belfast did. Amongst the Irish medical educators, this provoked consternation, and for the fledgling republic, it was a source of embarrassment. How reliable as a list it was? Well, as it happens, the AMA delegates who visited Ireland had not even bothered to inspect RCSI, blithely assuming it was an examining body only, like the College of Physicians. Or, to put it another way, as far as RCSI was concerned, there were no knights in shining armor coming galloping across the Atlantic. Likewise, at home, in the mid-1960s, there were few in the corridors of power who were championing RCSI. Indeed, the official line was that it would be no harm if RCSI closed down altogether. I did warn you this was the falling action section. So unglamorous times. But I don't want to bring you down completely. So here's a little 1960s glamour. Parts of this movie were filmed in RCSI in the anatomy room. I love that tagline. She whispered his name and he was lost. But don't worry, all is not lost. Now we have the turn, the denouement, that is Act 5, resolution. And the turn towards stability starts here with this building, largely paid for by alumni. This was what saved RCSI, the international network it had been fostering for decades. RCSI invested in its own future by putting its faith in talk and chalk, and as time went on, in 1,000 other pedagogic innovations, meaning you can trace a direct line from this building to this one in Bahrain. And the solar energy project they are currently engaged with is just phenomenal, if you've heard a little about that. To this one then on York Street, and to this one now springing up very, very fast on St. Stephen's Green. But hang on a second. What do buildings do? They start again. They open doors. Literally every morning, they open doors. Like the trees in Philip Larkin's poem, they begin afresh, afresh, afresh. And that's really more exposition. It's certainly not denouement. It's certainly not resolution, because resolution means an end. When I was writing the book, The History of the College, I knew I needed a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in some respects, I made RCSI's achievement of university status into that end, put a shape on the story. But a book is one thing, an institution is very much another. RCSI has a beginning, and conceptually at least, a middle, but it has no end in sight, not by a long shot. So this is where my 5-act structure threatens to crumble, except I'm going to pivot and declare that all along I've been working in an experimental form. This is, after all, a scientific institution. I think we can be comfortable with the idea of experimentation, because in its way too, RCSI is one vast, organic and ever-changing global experiment, one that with every autumnal intake begins afresh, 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 and long may it continue to do so. Thank you very much for your attention.